Okay, so this chapter is pretty tame compared to the last few. There's no trigger warnings that I can think of putting in here. Um, so I'm gonna just start. Um, Chapter 9, Events on the Jetty. Candy heard a chorus of voices, all speaking the same word. Lady, they were saying. Lady, lady, lady. It took her several moments to realize that these many voices were all addressing her. It was the Johns speaking. Mischief, Fillet, Sallow, Moot, Drowse, Plucket, Serpent, and Slop. They were all calling to her, trying to get her to wake up. She felt herself tentatively shaken, and, just as tentatively, she opened her eyes. 8 concerned faces were looking down at her, one large and 7 smaller. "Anything broken?" John Fillet said. Candy made a very cautious attempt to sit up. The back of her neck hurt, but it was no worse than the ache she sometimes woke when she'd been sleeping in an odd position. She moved her legs and her arms. She wiggled her fingers. "No," she said, somewhat surprised at her good fortune, given the distance she'd fallen. "I don't think anything's broken." "Good," said John Sallow. "Then we can get moving." "Wait," said Mischief. "She's only just—" "Sallow's right," said John Fillet. "We haven't got time to wait. That damnable creep Shade is going to be down here in a few seconds." "Shape!" The sound of his voice was enough to make Candy seize Mischief's arm and haul herself to her feet. The last thing she wanted was Mendelssohn Shape's claws around her throat a second time. "Where are we off to?" she wanted to know. "We're going home, lady," Mischief said. "You're going to yours, and we're going to ours." He put his hand into his inside pocket. "But before I go," he said, dropping his voice to a whisper as he spoke, "I wonder if you could possibly do something for me, for us all, until we meet again." "What do you need?" Candy said. "I just need you to carry something for us, something very precious." From the interior of his jacket he brought an object wrapped up in a little piece of coarsely woven cloth and secured with a brown leather thong that had been wrapped around it several times. "There's no need for you to know what it is," he said. "In fact, if you don't mind, it's better you don't. Just take it and keep it safe for us, will you? We'll be back, I promise you, when Carrion's forgotten about us, and we can chance the return trip." "Carrion?" "Christopher Carrion," John Serpent said, his voice laden with anxiety. "The Lord of Midnight." "Will you take this for us?" said John Mischief, preferring the little parcel. "I think if I'm going to carry something important," Candy said, "I should at least know what it is, especially if it's important." "What did I tell you?" Serpent said. "I knew she wouldn't be content with that. It's better if you don't know line. She's entirely too inquisitive, this one." "Well, if I'm going to be a messenger girl," Candy said, addressing John Serpent, "I think I have a right." "Of course you do," Mischief said. "Open it up. Go on. It's all yours." Curiously enough, the little parcel seemed to have almost no weight, except for that of the wrapping and the cord. Candy pulled at the large knot, which, although it looked hard to undo, seemed to solve itself the moment she began to pick at it. She felt something move in the parcel. The next moment there was a rush of light out of the bag, which momentarily filled her gaze. She saw several points of brightness appear before her, joined by darting lines of luminescence. They hovered for a moment, then the lights sank away into her unconscious and were gone. The whole spectacle, which couldn't have taken more than 3 seconds, left her speechless. "You have the key now," John Mischief told her gravely. "I beg you to tell nobody that you have it. Do you understand? Nobody." "Whatever you say," she replied, looking at the empty bag, mystified. Then, after a moment, I don't suppose you're going to tell me what door this key opens? Truly, lady, better not. He kissed her hand, bowing as he did so, and began to retreat from her. Goodbye, lady, he said. We have to go. Candy had been facing the tower throughout this conversation. Only now, as Mischief retreated from her, did she realize what a change had come over the world in the brief time in which she'd been unconscious. A ramshackle jetty had appeared out of the ground, and at its far end large waves were breaking, their weight sufficient enough to make the structure creak and shake down its entire length. Beyond the breaking waves, the Sea of Isabella stretched off toward a misty blue horizon. Minnesota, at least as Candy had known it, had apparently disappeared, overwhelmed by this great expanse of invading water. How, Candy said, staring at the panorama, slack-jawed with astonishment, how is this possible? You called the waters, lady. You remember, with the cup and ball? I remember, she said. Now I must go home on these waters, Mischief said, and you must go back home to Chickentown. I'll return, I promise, when it's safe to do so, and I'll claim the key. In the meanwhile, you cannot imagine what service you are doing to freedom throughout the islands by being the keeper of the key. He bowed to her again, and then, politely but firmly, he nodded toward Chickentown. Go home, lady, he said, like a man attempting to send home a dog that didn't want to leave his side. Go back where you're safe, before Shape gets down from the tower. Please. What you carry is of great significance. It can't be allowed to fall into Shape's hands, or rather, into the hands of his master. Why not? What happens if it does? I beg you, lady, Mischief said, the urgency in his voice mounting. Ask no more questions. The less you know, the better for you. If things go wrong in the Abarat and they come looking for you, you can claim ignorance. Now there's no more time for conversation. He had reason for his urgency. There was a loud noise from out of the tower behind them, as Shape attempted to clamber back down the broken staircase. Judging by the din from within, it wasn't an easy job. His weight was causing yet more of the structure to collapse. But it would only be a matter of time, Candy knew, before he navigated the remnants of the staircase and was out through the door in pursuit of them all. All right, she said, reluctantly conceding the urgency of her departure. I'll go. But before I go, I have to have one proper look. At what? The sea, Candy said, pointing off down the jetty towards the open expanse of bright blue water. She'll be the death of us, Serpent growled. No, said Mischief. She has a perfect right. Mischief grabbed hold of Candy's hand and helped her up onto the jetty. It creaked and swayed beneath them. But having dared the tower's stairs and balcony, Candy wasn't in the least intimidated by a little rotten wood. The jetty shook violently with every wave that struck it, but she was determined to get to the end of it and see the Sea of Isabella for herself. It's amazing, she said, as they proceeded down the length of the jetty. She'd never seen the sea before. All thought of Shape and his claws had vanished from her head. She was enchanted by the spectacle before her. I still don't see how it can have happened, she said. A sea coming out of nowhere. Oh, this is the least of it, lady, Mischief said. Out there, far off from here, are the 25 islands of the Abarat. 25? One for every hour of the day, plus the 25th hour, which is called Odom's Spire, which is a time out of time. It all sounded too strange and preposterous, but then here she was standing on a jetty looking out over a sea that hadn't existed minutes before. If the sea was real, and real it was, or why else was her face cold and wet, then why not the islands too, waiting off where the Sea of Isabella met the sky? They had come to the end of the jetty. She gazed out over the waters. Fish leaped up, silver and green, the wind carried sea-birds, the likes of which she had never seen or heard before. In just a few seconds, Mischief and his brothers were going to be gone into these mysterious waters, and she was going to be left to return to her boring, suffocating life in Chickentown. Oh, God! Chicken Town! After all of this, these wonders, these miracles, Chicken Town! The thought was unbearable. "When will you come back?" she asked Mischief. "Wait, lady," Mischief replied. "What?" "Stay very still." As he spoke, he went into the outer pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out, of all things, an old-fashioned pistol. It was a small weapon, and it looked as though it was made of brass. "What are you doing?" she said, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Doing what I can," he said softly, "to save our lives." She saw his eyes flicker over his shoulder in the direction of somebody on the jetty behind her. "Shape?" she murmured. "Shape," he replied. "Please, lady, don't move." So saying, he suddenly stepped to the side of her and fired. There was a loud crack, and a plume of purple-blue smoke erupted from the barrel of the pistol. A moment later there was a second sound, a much less loud, as a bullet struck its intended target. Candy knew immediately what John Mischief had done. He hadn't shot Shape. He'd fired at the cup on the top of the pyramid, and the ball had jumped out of it. She could instantly sense the massive change in the air around them. "Nice shot," said Sallow. "Though why you couldn't have put a bullet through Shape's eye defeats me." "I take no pleasure in putting holes in living things," Mischief said, pocketing the gun. Candy glanced over her shoulder. Shape was standing about halfway along the jetty, glancing back toward the tower. It was clear that he too knew what Mischief had done. How could he doubt it? The air was vibrating with the news. "The tide's changing, lady," Mischief said, "and I have to go with it. Shape will follow me, all being well, because he believes I have the key." "No, wait!" Candy said, seizing hold of Mischief's arm. "Don't do this!" "Don't do what?" John moot. "I don't want to go back to Chicken Town." "Where else can you go?" said John Sallow. "With you!" "No," said John Serpent. "Yes," said Candy. "Please. I want to go into the water." "You have no idea the risks you'd be taking." "I don't care," Candy said. "I hate where I live. I hate it with all my heart." As she spoke, she felt the wind change direction. The waters around the jetty had become highly agitated now, almost frenzied, in fact. The tide was turning on itself, and in the process making the antiquated boards of the jetty rattle and shake. She knew she only had a few seconds to persuade Mischief and his brothers. Then they'd be gone, into the water and away with the tide, away to the Abarat, wherever that was. And what chance did she ever have of seeing them again, once they'd gone? Sure, they'd tell her they'd come back, but what was a promise worth? Not much, in her experience. How many times had her father promised never to slap her again? How many times had she heard him swear to her mother that he was going to give up drink forever? None of it meant anything. No, once they were gone, she might very well never see them again. And what would she be left with? A memory and a life in Chicken Town. "You can't do this to me," she told Mischief. "You can't leave me here, not knowing if you'll ever come back." As she spoke, she heard the jetty creak behind her. She looked around, already knowing what she would see. Mendelssohn's Shape was coming down the jetty toward them. For the first time she saw quite clearly why he limped, and perhaps why he hadn't been quite agile enough to catch hold of her. He was missing his right foot. It was severed at the ankle, and he walked on the stump as though it were a peg leg. If it gave him any pain, he didn't display it. He wore his arrowhead-toothed grin as he approached his victims, spreading his arms like an old-style preacher welcoming into his lethal flock. Candy knew she still had a chance to escape, but she had no desire to turn back. Even if it meant risking life and limb to stay here on the jetty with Mischief, it was worth the risk. She grabbed a fierce hold of Mischief's hand and said, "Wherever you all go, I go." 8 faces looked at her, wearing 8 different expressions. Philip looked perplexed, Sallow blinked, Moot feigned indifference. Drowse laughed. Pluckett sucked in his cheeks. Serpent scowled, and Slop blew out his lips in exasperation. Oh, and Mischief? He gave her a wide, but unquestionably desperate, smile. You mean it? He said. Shape was 30 yards away from them, closing fast. Yes, I mean it. Then it seems we have no choice, he said. We have to trust to the tide. Can you swim? Not very well. Oh, Lordy Lou, Mischief said, and this time all 8 faces did the same thing. They rolled their eyes. I suppose not very well we'll have to do. Then what are we waiting for? Candy said. In the time it had taken them to have this short conversation, Shape had halved the distance between his claws and their throats. Can we please go? Drowse said, yelling louder than a head so small had any business yelling. Hand in hand, Candy and Mischief raced to the end of the jetty. 1, said Flicket. 2, said Pluckett. Jump, said Slop. And together they leaped into the air, committing their lives to the frenzied waters of the Sea of Isabella. And with that is the end of part 1. Tomorrow, hopefully, we'll start part 2. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked, please click like. If you want to share with people, leave a comment. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a good night.